Good evening, listeners. It's time to settle in for another chilling story of suburban suspense. From the slumbering heads of Mount Rushmore to the twinned and windy cities. From the unseen depths of the Great Lakes to the rustling husks of cornfields across the heartland. Who knows what ghouls and crawling creatures lurk among us under the Midwest moon. Every rooftop and coffee shop is suspect here on Fear Falls Radio Theater.
It wasn't the greenhouse that scared Rick, with its clouded windows and the skeletons of dead plants hanging inside, their vines casting shadows like spindly tentacles reaching toward the house. What scared Rick was the way it lit up on its own in the dark, a blip of inexplicable light that cut out just as he looked its way.
Rick watched the greenhouse from the kitchen, standing alone as he refreshed his drink. Laughter and music kicked up in the living room, but Rick was struck still by movement in the dark yard. Something inhuman inside the greenhouse. It crept from the far end of the greenhouse toward the door, human-sized but animalistic, its face reflecting moonlight like wet amphibian skin. The hint of something spookily familiar to Rick. Cautiously, he leaned closer to the window to make sense of the creeping figure when something tapped his foot and he gasped, wrenching his leg away. His eyes flew back to his task. He had filled his glass past the brim, cherry wine pooling on the counter and trickling onto his shoes.
Hey, come back to the game!
A voice shouted from the living room. The greenhouse light winked on and back off.
Rick, it's your turn!
A second voice urged. Rick blinked at the window, his stunned reflection all he could see in the dark pane. He hastily mopped up the wine from the counter and floor and tossed the dripping dish rag in the sink.
He had imagined it. All the excitement of the day had made him jumpy, and he heaved a deep breath to steady himself before rejoining the party. A housewarming celebration for friends who'd just married. They moved in at the perfect time, that short-lived stretch of fall between heat-stroke temps and snow-packed curbs. Earlier that day, as the group huffed to carry in box after box, the house had looked idyllic. Wet pavement confettied red and gold, and sunlight glinting off the greenhouse in the back.
Rick loved this time of year, the air full of cinnamon, smoke, and cloves. He loved even more this time of life. His friends were old enough to buy homes, but young enough still to play the games that made them howl in college. Waterfall and salad bowl, and the classic Truth or Dare, which demanded that Rick and Maddie jump up now and sprint a lap around the house.
Rick and Maddie raced onto the front stoop and down the steps, neck and neck, before Maddie took the lead around the front hedges. Rick squinted to see much in the night, only catching glimpses of Maddie's swinging hair as she laughed, just steps ahead. He lost sight of her bolting through the side yard when suddenly a scream shot through the dark.
Maddie!
Rick gasped, panic coursing through him. He caught up to find her crumpled on the ground. Something had a hold of her leg. Rick rushed to her side as she struggled to break free from a garden hose, tangled around her ankle. She had tripped over the sprinkler. In seconds, she was back up and running.
Rick froze a moment before taking off again, circling wider from the house to avoid all the tripping hazards in the dark. His route took him a fingertips distance from the greenhouse. He was barely aware of how close he passed when suddenly 2 unblinking eyes appeared on the other side of the glass, yellow with jagged black pupils.
Rick reeled backward, disbelieving, and scrambled as fast as he could to get back inside the house. He was breathless, and his body hummed, a cocktail of terror and adrenaline. He sputtered out that he'd seen something in the greenhouse.
I believe it. The last owner never kept it up. I bet all kinds of creepy crawlies are nesting in it.
Maddie said. Rick started to explain it wasn't spiders or raccoons that had his heart pounding, but Maddie continued.
You know what the greenhouse reminds me of? The Frogman.
Frogman.
Their friend laughed. Rick's breath caught. A remembered dread filled his chest, like an unwelcome guest visiting again.
Yeah, when we were kids, Rick pretended a frogman, or was it, no, a newt. A giant newt followed him around the neighborhood and fed on dead plants.
She shook her head, smiling at the memory.
Anyway, that newt would have all the dead leaves he could eat back there.
The group laughed, oblivious to Rick's panic, the terror overtaking him where he stood.
Who wants more food?
The host asked, sliding the meat and cheese tray across the coffee table. Rick was thankful for the change in topic.
I'm surprised Buddy hasn't snatched up all the salami.
Maddie said as she reached for an olive.
Actually, where is he?
Rick realized he hadn't seen the dog in some time. Unusual for the social puppy. Suddenly his gut clenched, remembering he'd let the dog out when he refreshed his drink. He slowly rose and walked back to the kitchen. Just as he rounded the corner, he saw the greenhouse light go dark. Rick moved to the back door. Cautiously, he pushed it open and called out into the dark yard. At the sound of his voice, something shifted and fell against the greenhouse wall. Rick could hear Buddy's collar tinkling and the rustle of dry leaves. And then Rick heard nothing for several strained moments before Buddy bounded out of the dark and onto the back patio.
You scared me.
Rick sighed, flooded with relief.
Oh, you sneaky boy.
He bent down to pet Buddy's head and rub his belly.
Okay, in you go. Come on, let's go inside.
Rick said, holding the door open for Buddy, who scooted in. Rick pulled the door closed, but just before it latched, something caught in the door. A hand reaching out, wet and webbed. Rick could close the door on the monstrous arm, slicing it clean off, but he knew it would just grow back. It always grew back.